Never be fooled by a coma. The most terrifying psychological manipulator is the one who lies still and listens to you. Medical record Adrian Whitmore. A quintessential narcissist, he chooses to seal his body away to conduct an extreme test of loyalty. He enjoyed exposing Vanessa's true colors as she stripped away her mask of pity. But Adrian's psychological blind spot is the appearance of Nana. Adrian's being overwhelmed by the maid's sincerity wasn't exactly romantic love, but rather a compensatory reaction from a brain already exhausted by the cycle of lies he himself had created.
There's no need to fight it, Mr. Whitmore. Na's voice was a low current in the quiet room as she adjusted his pillow. Sometimes God demands a man be still, she offered, so he can finally listen to what he was too busy to see. In the antiseptic air and filtered light of the hospital, her words carried an unvarnished honesty. Na Hayes was a constant, quiet presence at Adrian Whitmore's side. A damp cloth, a dry towel, the sleeves of her cardigan pushed back with purpose. For 3 days, her movements were a gentle liturgy, wiping his brow, smoothing the crisp sheets across his chest. The only sounds were the steady, electronic beat of the heart monitor and the whisper of rain against the window pane. Adrian was a statue, a performance of absolute stillness he had long ago mastered. Eyes shut, breath drawn in a slow, deep rhythm. The contusion blooming at his temple was real enough for the cameras, for any medical staff outside his trusted circle. To the world, Adrian Whitmore, the 40-year-old sovereign of Chicago's underworld, a man whose name was a currency of fear and finance, was lost in a coma. Yet inside that self-imposed silence, Adrian was awake. He was listening, and as Na leaned close to tuck a sheet, an old, sealed-off part of him began to fracture. "I imagine you can't hear me," she said, her shy sincerity filling the room. "But I've never believed people stop listening just because we can no longer hear them." A small, uncertain smile touched her lips as she glanced down at her own hands. "My mother used to talk to my father this way when he was near the end," she went on, her voice softer still. He couldn't answer, but she'd tell him of the weather, who sent mail, what was for dinner. A pause. "Love doesn't need a reply. It just stays. That's what it does." The words landed. Adrian felt an unexpected pressure build behind his closed eyes. His entire existence was a structure of artful deceit. Loyalty was a transaction, respect was a byproduct of terror, and desire wore the mask of devotion. No one had ever spoken of love as this, something so plain and steadfast, a thing built from weather reports and the simple promise of not leaving. Nana gently wrung out the cloth. "I think you must have been lonely for a very long time, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice sinking to a near whisper. "And powerful men, they have a special kind of solitude, don't they? Everyone is there for something. Eventually, nobody remembers how to just be there for you." The observation struck him like a shard of glass. A sharp, immediate pain pierced his chest, something real and unwelcome, not part of the act, but an ancient ache. The profound agony of being seen, truly seen, by the only person who had no motive other than kindness. He had to fight the urge to open his eyes, to sit up and demand how she had unraveled in 3 days, a truth his world had conspired to ignore for 2 decades. But the moment was wrong, and so he remained a sculpture of inaction as a single tear escaped and was swallowed by the pillowcase. As Na reached to adjust the blanket, she saw it. She stopped, her expression clouding with concern at the small, damp mark. Then, with a touch of impossible care, she used a dry corner of the towel to erase the evidence. "Even the strongest men need to rest," she whispered. A fire ignited in Adrian's throat. Na set the cloth back in its basin. She glanced at his IV, A rote check born of habit, even though she knew the nurses were vigilant, and then gathered her things. She paused at the door, her gaze falling on him one last time. "You're not alone," she said with quiet certainty. "Not in this room." And then she was gone, the door closing with the soft reverence of someone who understands that another's pain is sacred ground. The room fell still. Behind his eyelids, Adrian stared into the black, breathing against the crushing weight in his chest. He had orchestrated this entire tableau as a crucible, a test designed to draw out the greedy and expose the sycophants, to see who would circle when his power seemed to have vanished. He was ready for the scheming. He was ready for the lies. He had not prepared for this kind of pain because Nana's words had found a place inside him that belonged to his mother, to an old grief, to the boy he had walled up alive beneath layers of bespoke wool and the monstrous name he had built for himself. Minutes stretched on before the door opened again. The very atmosphere of the room changed. An expensive perfume cut through the sterile air, followed by the sharp click of heels, the whisper of designer fabric. "Adrian!" Vanessa's voice was a familiar, polished thing. His fiancée moved across the floor with the innate confidence of a woman who believes power is her birthright. She was beautiful in that cold, sculpted way that soothed politicians and charmed donors. She wore black cashmere and diamond studs, as if she had already negotiated a very stylish truce with widowhood. She stood over the bed for a long moment, silent. Then Adrian felt her lean close, her breath a cool whisper against his ear. "You just had to do it like this, didn't you?" she murmured. The practiced warmth was gone from her voice, replaced by a flat, weary annoyance. "You could orchestrate a room full of killers, but you couldn't manage your own damn stress." A short, impatient sigh. "Do you have any idea what this does to me?" Beneath the sheets, out of sight, Adrian's fingers tightened into a fist. Vanessa made a show of adjusting an item on the nightstand, playing to a phantom audience, then leaned in again. "The lawyers are asking about temporary authority. Your father's being difficult. The board is nervous. The vultures are circling Adrian, and I'm the one who has to sit here and perform grief." Her voice turned to ice. "If you had any consideration for me at all, you would either wake up or do everyone a favor and just die. Stop wasting our time." The words were a physical impact. For a heartbeat, a blinding rage threatened to shatter his control, a primal urge to rise and seize her cashmere-clad arm, to finally see what had been festering beneath that perfect surface. He wanted to watch real fear bloom in her eyes, but a lifetime of discipline was a cage of iron. Not yet. The rage receded, cooling into something harder. Certain now that he was gone to the world, Vanessa gave a small huff of frustration and walked to the window. Adrian heard the click of her phone unlocking. Her voice changed completely. It became soft, intimate. "Hey," she said. A beat of silence. He listened. "No, nothing, not even a twitch." Another pause and then a low, throaty laugh he had never, not once, heard her use with him. "I told you, Lucas, he's not coming back from this." Lucas, the name struck with more force than her cruelty. Lucas Whitmore, his stepbrother 6 years his junior, raised under the same roof after his father remarried. Lucas, who was smooth and charming, where Adrian was brutal and direct. A man he'd never fully trusted with the business, but whom he never conceived was capable of a betrayal this profound. Vanessa kept her voice low, but each syllable was a drop of poison in Adrian's ear. "Yes, I'm serious," she said. "The board is already fractured. If Richard keeps stalling on a clear succession, we trigger the proxy strategy. The moment they're convinced the company is rudderless, the vote will be ours. Then, that private, intimate laugh again. No, darling, I haven't forgotten the penthouse, or the accounts, or the Wisconsin lake house. It all becomes much cleaner once the legal team declares him permanently incapacitated. Adrian felt his own heart hammer once. A violent thud he was sure the monitor would betray. Vanessa's tone was lazy now, drunk on her own certainty. You were right. He was always too arrogant to imagine anyone in his own house could outplay him. He could feel her gaze drift back toward the bed. And honestly, Lucas, he made it so easy. Men like Adrian always think fear is the same thing as love. Lucas must have said something tender because her voice softened into a near purr. I miss you too, she said. Tonight, same place. We'll go over the asset schedule again. The asset schedule. Not grief, not fear, not even chaos. A plan, a blueprint to dismantle his company, his homes, his very life. Together. The fire in Adrian's blood froze, coalescing into something far more lethal than rage. It became a silent promise. He lay utterly still as Vanessa and his stepbrother planned for another minute, dissecting board members, family trusts, and the pliability of key executives. By the time she disconnected the call, the shock inside him had died. He was simply altered. Vanessa returned to the bedside. She looked down at his still form and, with a breathtaking coldness, laid her manicured hand over his. To think, she whispered, a flawless performance for an empty room. I almost loved you. She collected her purse and left. The door clicked shut. Silence returned, but it was nothing like the quiet Na had left behind. Na's silence was a space for healing. This was a poison that stained the air long after she was gone. Adrian lay in state, a master of a silent kingdom, staring inward at a truth now stripped bare. Na had spoken to the man. Vanessa had spoken to the assets. One had offered her quiet presence, while the other was already measuring the dimensions of his grave. He saw it now with perfect clarity. This was never a test of loyalty. It was an engine of revelation, and as the rain whispered against the hospital window, Adrian Whitmore, beneath the sterile white sheets, forged a covenant with himself. He would not rise today. But when he did, neither Vanessa Caldwell nor Lucas Whitmore would be left with a single shard of the world they had so greedily begun to claim. By noon, the hospital had taken on the feel of a high court in recess, serene on its surface, but churning with a verdict yet to be delivered. This exclusive neurology floor was a set piece designed to muffle the screams of the privileged. Walls of warm wood swallowed sound. The light was engineered to be kind. Each morning, fresh arrangements appeared at the nurse's desk, though never, by some silent decree, lilies. Here, the coffee was passable, the security was a ghost, and financial transactions were so seamless they preserved the illusion that dignity was not for sale. It was a space built so that wealth could believe its suffering was somehow more refined. Adrian lay still, a sentinel inside his own body. He'd built a life on knowing the difference between the words people performed and the ones they spoke when the energy for deceit was gone. A hospital is a temple to both. Just outside his door, 2 nurses murmured a liturgy of dosages and permissions. A little after 11, the neurologist completed his circuit. He shined a light into vacant pupils, cast a cursory eye over the monitor, and spoke his findings into a recorder with the detached rhythm of a man reading a weather report. Stable, unresponsive, no meaningful changes. Nathan Cole had played his role to perfection. The official narrative would hold for as long as was necessary. What Adrian had failed to account for was the sheer, brutal physicality of absolute stillness. His body became a landscape of rebellion. A slow burn ignited in his shoulders. Deep in his back, a single muscle began a low, persistent throb that grew louder with each passing hour. The simple act of keeping his jaw slack was its own exhaustion. Control had always been his power. But there is a world of difference between choosing to be silent and being buried alive by it. Sometime after noon, his father came. Richard Whitmore did not announce himself. It was never his style. Even at 70, he possessed the quiet gravity of a man whose presence once had the power to reset the rhythm of an entire room. His footsteps were nearly imperceptible on the gleaming floor. He offered the nurse a nod of dismissal, a courtesy, waiting until she had gone before pulling a chair to the bed. For a long beat, he just watched. A study. Adrian could feel the weight of that gaze, a familiar pressure. At last, Richard's voice, a low and arid sound, cracked the stillness. If I were a lesser man, I would think you'd finally perfected a method for extracting confessions without the tediousness of having to speak. Adrian gave no response. A faint, dry noise came from Richard, the sound of a familiar disappointment. The board is restless, Nathan tells me, predictable. Panic always infiltrates a bespoke suit far quicker than it does a man with calluses. He let that hang in the air. Vanessa was here. Her name was an anchor dropped into the quiet. Adrian felt a knot of heat tighten below his ribs, but his breath remained a perfect, even measure. Richard leaned back in the chair. I passed her in the corridor. She gave the distinct impression of being more inconvenienced by this than concerned. Another pause. Your mother always believed that a person's true character is revealed the moment they think pain gives them permission to be selfish. To invoke Catherine's name was to drop a stone into a well. Richard did so only when truth was more essential than comfort. You always had a fatal flaw for choosing women without substance. You mistook polish for a soul, he said, the words settling into the room's heavy silence. Then, a shift. His tone lost some of its iron. But that isn't why I came. The maid. She remained here last night long after her duties were done. Adrian's heart skipped. A flutter so faint it should have been imperceptible. The monitor beside him caught it. Richard, of course, saw. His voice never wavered. Sometime after midnight, a nurse dropped a tray down the hall. An explosion of sound, enough to wake the dead. That girl from the chair by the window was on her feet before anyone else had even moved. He gestured to the now empty chair. She looked terrified. Not a performance of fear, the real thing. And yet her first instinct was to move toward this door before her mind could even name the threat. Adrian remained a statue of flesh, but inside a lock had turned. Richard continued. Fear is a far more reliable witness than love. Never forget that. A minute ticked by. He rose, adjusted a cufflink, and laid a heavy hand on the metal guardrail of the bed. I won't ask if this is worth what it will cost you, he said, his voice dropping lower. You already know the answer might be no. He let out a long, slow breath. But you've started this. You will see it through to its conclusion, and you will do it with your eyes open. Do not look away when the truth is an insult to your own pride. And then he was gone. The room felt cavernous in his absence. Adrian lay in the quiet, replaying his father's testimony. Na had been afraid. That single fact was everything. He had no more use for manufactured bravery. His world was drowning in it. But she had moved toward the door, toward danger, toward the unknown, toward him. That one piece of data was a universe he explored for the rest of the day. At 2, Vanessa returned. Her visit was an exercise in efficiency, lasting under 10 minutes. She wore a camel hair coat, a leather portfolio clutched under her arm like a shield. That portfolio was a more honest declaration of her purpose than any words she could speak. She didn't bother to sit. She stood at the foot of the bed, her attention on her phone, firing off 2 messages before her eyes finally lifted, her face a careful sculpture of professional concern. "I've had a word with the family office," she said, her tone pitched for intimacy, as if they were co-conspirators in a shared tragedy. "There are some provisional papers. Signatures may be needed if things remain as they are." She tilted her head slightly. "I do hope you can understand the position this puts me in." There was no touch, no hand on his forehead, no fingers feeling for a pulse, not a single tremor in her voice. Just business. She checked her own reflection in the television's dark glass, smoothed an invisible imperfection in her hair, and left. Adrienne heard the soft click of the door latching and knew a cold, clean truth. Some people don't leave you in a crisis. They just reclassify your tragedy as paperwork. The afternoon bled into gray. The rain stopped, and a pale, watery winter sun painted a sterile patch to the floor. A nurse came and went, swapping an IV bag. A laugh, sharp and out of place, echoed from the hall, instantly smothered by a muffled apology. A janitor's whistle, 3 notes of a half-forgotten song echoed down the hall, a melody Adrienne felt he should know. Then, as the clock hand neared 4, she returned. He knew the sound of her approach before a word was spoken. Her gait was unlike any other on this floor. Not slower, not softer, but heavier with intention, as though she moved through the world, keenly aware that life itself was a fragile thing to be carried. She set a small paper cup on the table beside his bed. The steam carried the scent of coffee. For herself, not for him. Then the deliberate scrape of a chair being pulled close to him. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice pitched as if he were only sleeping, as if he might answer. The whisper of turning pages. A book. Adrienne lay in the silence and waited. "I brought something to read," Na said. "Nothing clinical this time. A feeling told me that if you are in there listening, you are probably sick to death of hearing men in white coats list your failings." In some silent, paralyzed corner of his consciousness, the ghost of a smile flickered. She opened the book, her voice a low, steady current as she began. It wasn't some grand drama. The sentences were plain, solid things that spoke of the weather, of bloodlines, of a small town's grim fight to hold on to its soul through bitter seasons. It was the kind of book his mother would have kept on her shelves because, as she was fond of saying, not all truths need to arrive like a bomb. After a few paragraphs, Na stopped. "My brother has no stomach for hospitals," she said. The words a simple offering of conversation. "He says they smell like worry and bad coffee." A small silence stretched. "He's usually right about things." She sipped from the cup. "His name is Ben," she added. "He's 21 and thinks he's immortal." Still screams at the television when the Cubs are playing, like the manager can hear him through the screen. A new warmth radiated from her voice as she spoke his name. Adrienne found himself listening with an intensity that had nothing to do with his deception. "My mother says that for some families, sports are the only thing they have that resembles a prayer." Na gave a quiet laugh. "She also says it's easier for 2 men to talk if they're both looking at a screen instead of each other." The observation was gentler than her words this morning, and because of that, it struck him with far greater force. This wasn't a performance, it was fellowship. The gesture was an act of such simple, unadorned humanity that Adrian felt a sudden, sharp sting of shame for how alien it was in his own life. Nana turned a page. "I wanted to be a doctor once," she said after a minute. The words were a statement of fact, not a lament. "A surgeon. I liked the idea that some problems can't be talked down or outplanned or pushed to another day. You just have to put your hands right where the damage is and try to make it right." That phrase hung in the air over him. Put your hands where the damage is. No one in his orbit spoke like that. Not the board, not Vanessa, not the men who applauded him at galas and feared him at clubs. Theirs was a vocabulary of leverage and exposure, of optics and assets. Nana's words were of people. She turned another page, the soft rasp of paper the only sound, before she paused. "You know," she said, her voice a quiet current in the room's sterile air. "My mother was raised in Indiana, a small town, church on Sundays, a pot roast waiting after, neighbors who recalled your birthday when they might forget their own. She still sends thank you cards, real ones written by hand. Manners, she says, are how we remind each other we are not animals." A silence settled. I think she would pity any man in a room this costly if he had no one to offer him a simple kindness. A band of steel tightened around Adrian's chest. He could see his own mother at her desk, the glide of a pen, ink bleeding blue onto thick cardstock, notes sent even to those from whom they could gain nothing. Good breeding, she had called it, is measured by the grace you show to people who can give you nothing in return. He had not heard that phrase in an age. With a sound of soft finality, Nana closed the book. "You should rest," she offered, a gentle lie when rest was all he did. She stood, adjusted the blanket over him a second time, and her hand came to rest on his. It lingered. The pressure was not intimate, nor was it incidental. It was simply warmth, offered without condition. "If you have ever been loved well," she whispered. The words meant only for the silence and for him. "I pray some piece of you remembers how it feels." And she was gone, the latch clicking shut with a muted finality. Adrian was left alone in the vastening quiet, staring into a darkness he himself had staged, the steady pulse of a machine, the only proof his heart still beat with the rhythm of a man in control. But control was becoming a threadbare conceit, because out there, beyond the polished door, his fiancée was managing his absence like an item on an agenda. His stepbrother was appraising his assets like a jackal circling a kill. Men in suits were charting his vulnerability in quarterly reports. And in here, in this room, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that did not flinch from truth had spoken of a decency that power could never purchase. For the first time since the performance began, Adrian felt the world tilt on its axis. He was no longer the author of this drama, he was its subject, and he was being weighed. As dusk bled across the Chicago sky, turning the window to a sheet of black marble, he lay perfectly still. But inside, a hairline crack had fractured his world into two distinct and irrevocable halves. There were those who leaned in when he had nothing left to give, and there were those who were already counting their inheritance. By the fourth morning, Adrian Whitmore was learning that silence is an autopsy. It dissects memory. It amplifies insult. It renders the difference between duty and devotion so stark that the smallest gesture carries an impossible weight. The room was a sterile, temperature-controlled vessel. but the light that pressed against the windows had the thin, judgmental quality of a Chicago October. A bruised ceiling of clouds hung low over the city. Beyond the glass, life continued its relentless ticking pace on Lakeshore Drive. The world was not waiting. Deals were being signed over coffee. Mothers were rushing children toward schoolhouse doors. Shutters were rolling up on storefronts. Espresso was steaming. Ledgers were being balanced, and Adrian Whitmore remained in his private room, a figure carved from ivory beneath white sheets, as the cartographers of his life began to draw new maps. Shortly after 8, Nathan Cole appeared. Nathan had been Adrian's doctor for a decade, though he held a much rarer position in Adrian's world, a friend who possessed the courage for honesty. He was in his late 40s, built with broad shoulders and the weary, rumpled aspect of a man who'd spent a lifetime delivering bad news to good people. He read the monitor first, an old habit, checked the drip of the IV, and then bent close, his voice a low confidence pitched beneath the ear of the camera. "You are pushing this far beyond my recommendation," Nathan murmured. Adrian offered no response. Nathan straightened, took up the chart, and shifted his voice to the louder, clinical tone of a physician performing for the record. "No discernible change in neurological status," he declared to the room, turning a page. Then softer again. "Your blood pressure shot up yesterday afternoon." The moment Vanessa had called Lucas, Nathan set the chart down. "I don't need you to speak. The machines tell their own stories. Whatever you heard, it found a nerve." He moved to the window, prying the blinds apart just enough to let in a sliver of gray light before they snapped shut. "I'm not here to repeat the lecture," he said. "It's pointless. But I am here with a reminder that a lie is a powerful sedative. In the right hands, it's a medicine, but it turns to poison when you lose control of the dose." The ghost of a smile brushed Adrian's lips. Nathan and his clinical metaphors. The doctor moved back to the bed, his hand adjusting the blanket in a motion that was a perfect cover for checking Adrian's stillness. "The board wants another report," he said. "Vanessa has called twice a day, so has your stepbrother." That word again. In Adrian's mind, Lucas was no longer a relative, but a kind of infection. Nathan lowered his voice to a near whisper. "One more thing. The maid approached me this morning." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, something flickered deep inside Adrian. Nathan caught it. "Yes." He breathed. "That reached you." He took out a penlight, a prop for a mock examination of Adrian's pupils. "She asked if patients in a coma can still feel kindness," he said. "Not treatment, not procedure, kindness. And before you assume anything, she looked exhausted. Said she was worried people might speak carelessly around you just in case you could hear." Nathan clicked off the light, stepping back. "Your world is full of people who know the price of everything," he stated, his voice flat with certainty. "That young woman seems to know the value of things. Do not confuse the two." His entire posture then shifted, the polished professional returning just as a nurse entered. 2 minutes later, he was gone. Adrian lay still, a perfect sculpture of inaction, but his mind was a tempest. Kindness. Nena had asked about kindness, not about his prognosis, not the estate, not the line of succession. Kindness. He saw his mother's face, a memory from when he was 19, already brittle with the kind of grief that calcifies in young men. Cruelty, she had told him, is merely fear in a well-tailored suit. He had dismissed it then, another of Catherine Whitmore's sentimental notions. But now, in this room, with one woman offering patience and another performing a vigil, he began to wonder what else his mother had seen, what truths his own power had rendered him blind to. The answer arrived late that morning, wearing Vanessa Caldwell's silhouette. She moved with her signature, unshakable grace, but there was a new tautness in her frame, a tension vibrating just beneath the surface. The sound of her heels on the tile was sharper. The curve of her smile was pulled just a little too tight. Her perfume was a declaration, as if hoping its sheer expense could anchor a moment that was threatening to slip from her grasp. "Good morning, Adrian," she said, the words hollow, devoid of any morning's promise. She selected the chair beside his bed, crossed her legs, and consulted her phone before she made a single move to touch him. If she saw the terrible poetry in the gesture, she gave no sign. "I was just at the Whitmore building," she began, her tone assuming he'd find solace in corporate minutia. "Half the VPs look like they're at a funeral and don't know who to send the bill to. There is instability everywhere. Do you have the faintest idea what that does to an enterprise of this size?" She left the question to die in the silent air. Adrian heard the crisp rustle of paper. "I've drafted a public statement, pending your father's approval," she continued. "A demonstration of unity is what's needed." Unity! She spoke the word like a line item in a contract, stripped of all human warmth. Vanessa's hand finally settled on his. Her skin was cool, her fingers inert, a gesture that felt rehearsed, learned from a book on bedside comportment. "I have been incredibly loyal to you," she said, her voice dropping. A deep cold moved through Adrian. People who are truly loyal never have to say it. Vanessa stayed seated for several more minutes, as if waiting for a silent witness to mark her devotion down in a ledger. When none appeared, she rose and crossed to the window. He heard the definite click of her phone being unlocked. Then, after a swift glance down the hall, she was dialing Lucas. "Don't start!" she hissed, her voice a blade of irritation. "No. Richard refuses to authorize any transition. He's stalling." Her voice grew harder. "And the board is useless. They won't move unless they believe the old man is losing his faculties too." A pause. Adrian listened to the sounds, the controlled measure of her breathing, the absolute confidence in her voice, the profound ugliness of two people viewing the future as real estate to be seized. "Yes, I've been through the trust documents," she said into the phone. "There are vulnerabilities. We just have to let this play out." A tiny, sharp laugh escaped her. "No, I'm not worried about Adrian hearing me. If he ever wakes up, I will go to church every Sunday for the rest of my life out of pure, unadulterated shock." The line was meant as a witticism. Instead, it felt like a final turning of a key in a lock deep inside Adrian. This wasn't rage. Rage is a fire, a thing that burns and passes. This was ice. This was the part of a man that begins to make decisions from which he will never come back. Vanessa continued, her voice slipping into the intimate cadence she usually reserved for him. "I told you, Lucas, give it another week, and they will be begging for a new king. There will be no need to take a single thing. They'll give it all to us, simply to make the fear go away." A breath. Yes, she breathed, the steel in her voice melting away. I miss you too. The confession hung in the air, a beautiful, venomous vapor. Adrian had heard more than he ever wanted to. When Vanessa finally ended the call and glided back to the bed, she laid a hand on his shoulder, a performance of tenderness so exquisite it was an insult. You always insisted on making things so much harder than they had to be, she whispered, even at the end. And then she was gone. He remained in the profound silence that she left behind, his own breathing a ragged counterpoint to the machine's steady rhythm. His mother once told him that some betrayals don't shatter your heart because you lost love. They shatter it because you see with blinding clarity that love was never there to begin with. In the stillness, he finally saw. The ache that registered was no longer for the woman who had just left. It was a deep, hollowing grief for the man he used to be, a man who had seen admiration and called it loyalty, who mistook elegance for substance, who believed a controlled exterior meant a person had integrity. A man could build an entire kingdom and still be a fool in a single room. At 3, the light in that room changed. Nana came in carrying a fresh basin, a towel folded with precision, and a small paper bag that smelled of broth and rosemary. She wore the same gray cardigan as the day before, only now a small, meticulous mend was visible on the cuff. With her hair pulled back plainly and the faint blue shadows of fatigue beneath her eyes, she set the soup down, went to the window first, and angled the blind so the afternoon light would not fall across Adrian's face. Still cloudy, she noted, her voice low, as if picking up a conversation from yesterday. My mother believes Shabs keeps its finest days for the people who have no way of going out to see them. A quiet moment passed between them. She neared the bed, her hand moving to check his blanket before it froze, suspended in the air, arrested by the rigid set of his jaw. It was a detail so slight it was almost nothing. But Nana saw it. Oh, she breathed, the sound a private realization. Did somebody trouble you? Adrian felt his own pulse quicken. Nina's eyes flickered to the door and then back to him. I know how that must sound, she murmured. But sometimes a room feels different after someone leaves, like opening an oven door and smelling that something has burned while your back was turned. If he could have laughed, he would have, but he could not. He could only listen. Nana dipped the cloth in the warm water, her touch gentle as she cleaned one side of his face. When my father left, she began after a moment, my mother refused to say a single ugly thing about him for weeks, not one. A ghost of a smile touched her voice. Then, one morning, she was buttering toast and just said, well, I hope he enjoys making someone else a disappointment for a while. She stopped her work. It was the angriest thing she said the entire year. Nana rinsed the cloth. I once thought strength was about shouting or slamming doors or making sure you had the final word. Her voice became softer still. Now I see that strength is just holding on to your decency when someone has given you every reason to let it go. The sentence moved through Adrian with a terrible, perfect clarity. Decency. He understood with a sudden sinking finality that it was the one thing his power had never once required of him. Efficiency, yes. Intelligence was currency. Fearlessness, non-negotiable. But decency, no. That was for his mother, for the women from church who appeared with casseroles after a funeral, for men who stood up when an elder entered a room, even when nobody important was there to see. It was for people like Nina. She set the cloth aside, unfolding the fresh towel. "I am sorry if people are not careful with you," she said. "If you can hear this, I hope you know that not everyone who enters this room wishes you harm." Not everyone. What a small, incredible grace. Then a fractional hesitation before her hand came to rest over his. A brief, weightless touch. "If you come back," she whispered, "I hope you come back to something true." When she left, the words seemed to remain, imprinted on the air long after the lock clicked. Adrian lay beneath the white expanse of the blanket as the city outside bled into night, the monitor beside him marking a kind of time he no longer inhabited. His trial had started as a question of loyalty. It was becoming something else now, a reckoning. Every hour that passed was an unmasking, revealing not just the substance of those around him, but the man he had chosen to be among them. And for the first time in a very long time, Adrian Whitmore found that self-knowledge a far heavier weight than any enemy. The fifth morning broke across a pale, bruised sky, carrying the silent tension of a city that senses one of its pillars is about to crumble. Adrian Whitmore was a still figure under the sterile white sheets, but his mind was cutting through the fog with a sharpness he hadn't known in years. Being motionless had stripped every distraction away. The silence had taken apart every lie he believed. Now he could hear the truth in every voice that crossed the threshold. Some were practiced, others were terrified, and one was honest. At 5 a.m., the door opened with a barely audible turn of the knob. Nina stepped inside, a small paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. A scent followed her: oatmeal, cinnamon, fresh coffee. It was a smell so profoundly normal that it felt like a rebellion in this world of antiseptic and filtered air. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice quiet, addressing him as if he were a man who had simply chosen silence for a time. She set the thermos on the side table and then, thoughtfully, checked the room's climate, nudging the thermostat up just a fraction. He had always preferred a warmer room in the morning, a small act of defiance against the endless Chicago winters. It was a detail Nina had noticed in her first month at the penthouse, when she saw how he would hold his coffee cup a little longer on the colder days. She moved to the window, opening the blinds just so, letting in the day's timid light without the assault of a glare. "The rain finally stopped, it seems," she observed softly. "My brother says a city feels more truthful after a storm has passed through." Adrian listened. He was starting to realize that Nina spoke in small, elemental truths, offering them up as simple observations. She never performed for him. Her words were never staged for effect. And yet almost everything she said felt as if it were built upon some deep, sincere foundation. After pouring herself some coffee, she opened the paper bag. "I made oatmeal," she said plainly. "Hospital food isn't meant to be encouraging. My mother says a warm breakfast can make a person feel less abandoned by the day ahead." That one word, abandoned, seemed to hang in the sterile quiet. Nina sat, pulling out a small notebook, her eyes moving down a handwritten list as he heard the faint scratch of a pencil. "Medication times, check hydration, lower the overhead light," she murmured under her breath. These were not duties he had assigned. They weren't in any contract. They were things she simply did. A sense of duty had been woven into her long before she ever walked into his life. After a few moments, she looked at him, her expression serious. "I know the doctors say a routine is good for recovery," she started gently. "So, I am going to speak to you as one speaks to a person who matters." She placed her hands in her lap. "My mother always taught us that people must be treated with dignity, especially when they are in no position to defend their own," she continued. She said, "Dignity is the one thing poverty can't steal from you. You have to be the one to give it away." A familiar tightness returned to Adrian's chest. He tried to count the men he knew who spoke of respect endlessly, but who had never once said the word dignity. Nana leaned in, straightening his blanket. "I don't know what your life is like," she said with a quiet honesty, "but I have a feeling that people are not often free to speak their minds around you." No, they were not. They performed, they angled, they flattered, they measured every syllable. They constructed their questions like traps. Honesty was a foreign currency. "I grew up in a place where people would argue at the top of their lungs," Nana went on, "but they were also the first to show up. A car would break down, and 3 men would come out of their houses with tools. Someone lost their job, and a neighbor would bring over an extra pot of soup." The faintest smile appeared. "My mother calls community another name for people who refuse to let each other vanish." The sentence landed somewhere deep inside of Adrian. Refuse to let each other vanish. In his world, people vanished all the time, sometimes by choice and sometimes not. Nana picked up the book from the day before, but she did not open it immediately. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, a quick, subtle check to ensure they were still alone. Her voice was even quieter when she spoke again. "I know there is a lot of worry," she said. "The nurses talk, the families talk. They think that when a man is powerful, he doesn't suffer in the same way an ordinary person does." She paused. "But suffering doesn't check your bank account before it arrives." The sheer simplicity of the thought hit him harder than any grand speech ever could. "Suffering doesn't check your bank account." She began to read, her voice a steady, calm current, telling a story of a farmer rebuilding his world after a long drought. Adrian was not following the plot. He was listening instead to the sound of her voice. Its unwavering center, its complete lack of pretense or fear. Halfway through a page, Nana stopped reading. "My brother used to repair watches," she said, the thought arriving as if from nowhere. "Very small ones, old ones that people thought were hopeless." Her eyes drifted to his wrist, which was bare, missing the heavy, expensive timepiece he never took off. "He told me timepieces aren't that complex," she continued. "They just demand patience and a steady hand. He said most things stay broken because people are in too much of a hurry." Her gaze seemed to soften. "I think people might be the same." The thought lingered there, a quiet, profound judgment, because Adrian Whitmore had built an entire world on the religion of speed. Fast deals, fast punishments, fast escapes. Patience was a currency he never traded in. The book closed with a soft finality. Nina's fingers grazed the water in the basin, a silent inquiry before she brought the cloth to his brow. "There's a tension in you today," she whispered, her voice a near audible thought. "I can feel it, even with your eyes closed." For a beat, her fingertips lingered at his temple. "I pray no one has spoken carelessly in your presence. A current passed through the stillness of Adrian's mind, and she felt it. She always did. My father taught me that words spoken over the helpless are a pure reflection of the soul, Nana murmured. It is no great thing to be kind to a man who can answer back. True grace is revealed when he cannot. Her hand retreated. The quiet did not last. It was shattered by the door swinging open, an act of violence against the stillness. Vanessa's arrival was an invasion of will, the sharp report of her heels on the floor a hostile rhythm in the hushed room. She had no time for artifice. "Oh!" she said, her voice flat, catching sight of Nana. "You're here." With a measured grace, Nana stood. "Yes, ma'am." Vanessa's handbag landed on the table, her eyes giving Adrian's form a cursory scan before she moved to the window. "Another session with the lawyers," she broadcast to the empty space. "This entire situation is becoming untenable." Her gaze cut to Nana. "You may go." A small hesitation. "I was attending to him, ma'am." Vanessa smiled, a chilling sculpture of politeness. "Then attend faster." Nana gathered the basin, her movements a portrait of dignity against the command's cold edge. As she passed his bed, her hand swept down in one last fleeting motion to smooth his blanket. "You are not abandoned here," she breathed, a promise stolen from the air before Vanessa could hear, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut. In an instant, the mask on Vanessa's face fractured. A sound, a bitter little puff of air escaped her lips. "This staff and their endless sentimental hovering," she mused aloud to no one. As if that could preserve the illusion, this is still a home. She glided toward him, her voice lowering into the intimate cadence of conspiracy. "You always did have a fatal flaw for the bleeding hearts," she observed, a note of old irritation surfacing. "It turned every simple negotiation into a goddamned opera." He lay motionless. "Strength is what forged your world," she continued, "and yet you let this softness fester in your private life." Her voice hardened, taking on the quality of steel. "Softness always comes at a price." She glanced at her phone. "Lucas?" she answered, and her entire being transformed. The voice became warm, pliable, conspiratorial. "The board is restless. No, Richard is still playing the loyalist, pretending this is all some temporary inconvenience." A pause hung in the air. I reviewed the trust documents again. The second they declare medical incapacity, the transfer of power is cleaner than we ever dared to hope. A low, chilling murmur. Adrian built his world on the idea that loyalty is born from fear. He never understood that fear vanishes the second a more profitable path reveals itself. A soft, cruel laugh. "Yes, we'll be careful." She fell silent, listening to Lucas. Vanessa's reply was softer now. "Of course I still want the lake house. I may not be sentimental, but I'm not a fool." Another silence. "No, no change. I told you, this is just a waiting game now." Adrian felt the familiar seizure in his chest, but the pain was new. It was no longer the jagged edge of shock. It was the cold, flat certainty of confirmation. Every word she uttered was a scalpel, peeling back the last layers of a life he thought he knew. The call ended. Her gaze fell upon him. "You should have chosen stability," she murmured. "Emotion is a poison to good judgment." She took her bag. "For whatever it's worth," she said, an afterthought offered to a ghost, "you were magnificent." And with that, she was gone. Silence reclaimed the room, but this time, for Adrian Whitmore, there was no doubt. There was only a terrible, perfect clarity. He could see it now, the true design of the test he'd set in motion. For a lifetime, power had been a wall between himself and the truth. Now his powerlessness was the lens through which he saw everything, and in that space, beyond the raw hunger of ambition and the quiet poison of greed, one person remained. Not from obligation, but from a belief that a man should not be left alone. The sixth morning dawned in a silence heavier than all that came before. Beyond the glass, Chicago moved under a pale, watery sun. But inside the suite, a pressure was building, an invisible storm front. The staff moved with a practiced quiet. Their professional instinct sensing a tectonic shift was underway beneath the still surface of Adrian Whitmore's unseeing eyes. Adrian had ceased to measure time in hours. It was now a weight, an accumulation. Every whispered word, every touch of compassion, every calculated gesture, it all layered itself into something more substantial than days on a calendar. He had staged this elaborate theater of collapse to see who, in the end, would remain when the curtain fell on his power. He had never imagined how profoundly the vigil would alter him. Shortly after 9, Nina entered, carrying a small paper cup and a crisply folded napkin. The scent of real chicken soup, not the hospital's sterile version, filled the room, a warm, honest fragrance against the cold air. "Good morning," she began, her voice soft. A trace of weariness was woven into it today, the subtle echo of a sleepless night. There were faint smudges of shadow beneath her eyes, but her bearing was resolute, a column of quiet respect. Adrian listened. He was learning the language of this place, how to read the fine print of a human soul. Nina carried fatigue, but never defeat. "I brought this from my home," she said, answering the unasked question. "My mother insists that a good broth can heal anything. She says the body remembers kindness even when the mind cannot." Nina lifted the lid. A small ghost of steam rose and vanished. "I hope she's right," Nina whispered. A moment passed. She moved to his side, checking the room's thermostat, before her hand found the blanket on his chest, making a small, perfect adjustment. Her movements were a daily liturgy, unhurried, intentional, calm. Her pace was not born from a lack of urgency, but from a deep, abiding respect for the fragility of the man in the bed. She sat, placing the napkin across her lap. "I saw Dr. Cole this morning." Her voice was quieter now. She said recovery is sometimes a silent thing, that we come back to ourselves not all at once, but in pieces. A beat of silence. "My mother believes faith is knowing what is possible long before you can see it." Faith. The word felt like a foreign country. In Adrian's world, faith had never been a viable asset. Strategy was, leverage was, brutal probability was. Faith was a form of surrender, and he had never learned the art of laying down his arms. Nina stirred the soup with a plastic spoon, a motion of pure ritual, as he could not eat. "I cannot imagine the life you have led," she continued, "but I have a sense that very few people ever gave you permission to be still." Her tone softened. "My father worked himself into an early grave. 2 jobs, my whole life. He never allowed himself a moment's peace. When he finally did stop, it was because his heart had nothing left." A shadow of a smile. "He told me once, a man can build an empire and forget to leave a single room in it where he's allowed to be human." The word struck something deep within Adrian's silent chest. A place to be human. He could not remember ever thinking such a place was necessary. Nina used the warm cloth to clean his hand, her touch gentle as she wiped away the faint, dry film of antiseptic. "You may not know this," she said, her voice low, "but people watch men like you the way we watch a coming storm. There is fascination, there is fear, sometimes even awe. But no one ever wants to stand where the lightning is going to strike." Her fingers rested on the pulse point of his wrist. "I don't think any of us are meant to live as a storm forever." The declaration hung in the air between them, its meaning absolute. He remembered the first man to call him frightening. He'd been 24, taking the reins of a company his father had nearly lost to an insider's betrayal. Fear had been a tool then, a weapon, his salvation. Fear rebuilt the walls. Fear drove the engine. But fear had never, not once, offered him a moment of peace. Nana rinsed the cloth, drying his hand with the napkin. "My hope," she said, her voice achingly sincere, "is that when you wake, you find someone who speaks to you with nothing but the truth." The words held no agenda. They were not a performance. They were simply a gift. She went quiet, as if she feared she'd said too much. Before she could stir, the door glided open. Vanessa stood there, her expression a careful portrait of controlled fury. She didn't bother to conceal it. "I was told visiting hours were being limited," she stated, her voice like ice, her gaze fixed on Nana. Nana was on her feet in a fluid, instant motion. "I'll return another time," she answered, her politeness a shield. Vanessa offered a sharp, satisfied nod of dismissal. As Nana gathered the soup container, her eyes swept across Adrian's still face, not searching for a sign, but as a simple act of witness. And then she left. The climate of the room changed instantly. Vanessa unbuttoned her coat, draping it across a chair with the proprietary air of a CEO taking her seat. "I met with the legal team this morning," she announced, her gaze directed somewhere past him. "Our initial projections are confirmed." She moved to the window, a slow drift. "Provisional authority becomes absolute if his neurological state remains indefinite." The words were a surgical incision, clinical and devoid of sentiment. Adrian willed every muscle into stillness, a statue absorbing the blow. Vanessa turned from the glass, her face lit by the glow of her phone. "Yes," she breathed into the device. "I just left the meeting." It had to be Lucas. It was forever Lucas. "The board is becoming restless." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. "Investors are asking questions." "No, Richard is still playing the part that this is a fleeting crisis." Her voice became a thread of sound. "We need another week." In that moment, something inside Adrian froze solid. 1 week. Time, for them, had become just one more piece on the board. "Correct," Vanessa whispered. "Should the neurologist's findings confirm sustained impairment, the transfer of power is ironclad." A silence. No, Adrian never accounted for weakness. His only strategy was ever utter dominance. A soft, cold laugh echoed in the room. "And that is the very reason any of this is possible." Those words ricocheted in Adrian's skull. "Reason any of this is possible." Dole. The true scope of this silent takeover was only now coming into focus. Vanessa's tone shifted, acquiring an almost intimate quality. "I know," she murmured into the phone. "Soon this performance can end." Performance? The irony was a physical weight. Adrian had engineered a fiction, and within it they had constructed a new reality. "Yes," Vanessa confirmed. The company's restructuring will commence immediately. Certain departments would resist, of course, but they would yield to new command once they saw it was the only way to survive. Father and the estate? A brief hesitation. I will handle that myself. Adrian's breathing was a measured, steady thing, but inside him, the last supports of his certainty collapsed into dust. As she ended the call, Vanessa approached the bed, her eyes scanning his face for a long moment, as if searching for some final, unspoken assent. You believed, above all else, that everything was an instrument of your will, she remarked, her voice a flat, impartial judgment holding neither cruelty nor compassion. It never entered your mind that the world might turn that same unblinking eye upon you. She gave his blanket a small, almost theatrical adjustment. For whatever it's worth, she said, her calm a chilling counterpoint to the room's silence. I learned your lessons well. Then she gathered her coat and was gone. The quiet that rushed into the void she left was different, heavier, more final. Underneath the pristine white linens, Adrian lay motionless, but the man who entered this hospital had ceased to exist. He had staged this elaborate lie to find loyalty, and instead he had discovered the truth. And the truth, he was starting to understand, is not a quiet thing you find. It is a declaration of war because the void between power and love had never been drawn so brutally clear. Power stays only as long as it has something to gain. Love stays when there is nothing left to take. He knew now, with a clarity that sickened him, which of the two had been standing watch over his bed. On the seventh day, the room no longer felt like a hospital. It had assumed the weight of a courtroom where the sentence was being composed long before the trial began. Adrian Whitmore was an inert form, a man distilled to a body, the pulse on the monitor a metronome marking dispassionate time. Beyond the window, Chicago was lost in the suffocating gray of a new winter, a sky that bled the color and warmth and sound from the world below. But in here, a severe clarity was taking shape. Each voice that breached the doorway now betrayed the speaker's soul with brutal efficiency. People confessed themselves to the seemingly unconscious. They let their truths spill into the quiet, forgetting that silence is not empty. And in that silence, Adrian was listening. Just after 8, Nana came in, her step soft, carrying a canvas tote in place of the usual plastic bag. She wore the familiar gray cardigan, but a scarf of washed-out blue was wrapped around her neck, a thin barrier against the encroaching chill. A whisper of wind followed her in, bringing with it the sharp scent of November and something more distant, like wood smoke. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than it had been, the deep tracks of exhaustion under her eyes now tempered by a new kind of calm. She placed the tote on the armchair before approaching the bed. Her routine was a silent meditation, checking the room's temperature first, then tilting the blinds so the pale light would fill the room without striking Adrian's face. "I brought something else today," she murmured, a note of apology woven into her words. "My mother baked bread last night. She is of the firm belief that fresh bread can mend almost anything." From the tote, she drew a small parcel wrapped in cloth. A subtle scent of warm wheat and rosemary began to seep into the air, a living aroma that pushed back against the room's chemical sterility. "She always says we believe medicine is the cure," Nana went on, carefully unfolding the cloth around the bread. "But the real healing begins when someone remembers you are still a person." And Adrian felt the mass of those words land inside him. She placed the bread on his bedside table, an act not of utility, for he couldn't eat, but of simple presence. Nana sat in the chair, opening a notebook where new ink marked the pages. Adrian could hear the faint whisper of a page turning. "You had a restless sleep," she noted, her eyes flicking toward the monitor's rhythmic lines. "The body finds its own way to wrestle with things the mind cannot, even when it is still." A space of silence fell between them before she spoke again. "My brother, he believes storms are just nature's way of reordering the world," she continued. "He says the air is always cleaner afterward, even if the landscape looks unchanged." Her hand drifted down, smoothing a wrinkle in the blanket so faint it was nearly invisible. "I think people are much the same." The thought lingered in the quiet, unhurried. Adrian had observed that she never rushed to fill a silence. She created space for the unspoken, as if in deference to a dialogue he could not participate in. After a moment, she took up her book, but she did not start reading right away. Instead, her voice found a register more intimate than before. "I was at my mother's late yesterday," she started, her tone low. "She asked about you." A slight pause, a moment of consideration. "I told her you were stable." A soft, almost self-conscious smile appeared. "She said I should remind you that pride is a terrible physician." The echo of his own mother's unsparing wisdom was uncanny. Nana shifted in her seat. "My mother says pride is a shield you carry through the lean years," she clarified, "but it becomes a cage when it stops you from taking a hand that's offered." Kindness. It always came back to kindness. It seemed to be the only real principle Nana navigated by, a language from a world far from his own. Her hands came to rest in her lap. "I imagine people who hold great power are seldom offered kindness without a price," she continued. "After a while, they must forget what it even feels like." The thought was delivered with a gentle, crushing accuracy. Adrian searched his memory for the last time anyone had given him anything without an expectation of return. The memory did not exist. At last, Nana began to read, her voice a steady current in the room, telling a story of an old man repairing a farmhouse shattered by storms. The story itself was patient, celebrating the slow work of mending over the violence of creation. She stopped at the middle of a sentence. "I have always been drawn to stories of repair," she reflected aloud. "Most are captivated by the spectacle of something new being built, but restoration demands you first understand why the thing was worth saving." Her eyes moved toward Adrian's still form. "I think that's the part we forget." The words took root somewhere deep inside him, this notion of understanding why. He had constructed a dynasty on the bedrock of survival, of necessity, of absolute dominion. But in all that furious building, had he ever once asked himself what, beyond the hoarding of power, was actually worth saving? He had no answer. Nana closed the book. "I should probably be quieter," she said gently. "The nurses say I treat this room like a parlor." A faint smile was audible in her voice. "But I think a hospital is a less dreadful place if you can hear the sound of a normal life." She took up a warm, damp cloth and began to softly clean his hand, erasing the drying residue of the room's sterile air. "You know," she said after a long moment, "my mother insists that loyalty is never a transaction." She wrung the cloth with a deliberate, careful motion. She calls it rented obedience. The words hit Adrian with the force of a physical impact. Rented obedience. He had built his entire world with it, Nana went on, her voice soft, almost a secret. True loyalty is quiet. It's the choice to show up when there is nothing to be gained. It's staying when the world is looking away. Her fingers came to rest on his wrist, a brief point of human warmth. I suppose that sounds hopelessly antiquated, she admitted. No, it sounded like a miracle. And before she could say another word, the door was thrown open without a knock. Vanessa was a silhouette in the doorway, her entire form a study in sharp, contained impatience. I was not informed that visiting hours had been made so flexible, she said, each word a shard of ice. Na was on her feet in an instant. I was just leaving. A curt nod from Vanessa was her dismissal. As Na gathered her bag, her gaze fell upon Adrian's still form one last time. You are not alone, she repeated, the sound barely a breath, and then she was gone. The moment the door clicked shut, Vanessa exhaled a sound of pure exasperation. I cannot comprehend this need for the staff to form these attachments, she said to no one. It's an inefficiency, a failure of professional distance. She set her handbag down, her movements precise, and began to stalk the perimeter of the room. The board is becoming restless, she announced, her attention already a world away. She paused by the window, her phone materializing in her hand. Yes, she began, the disembodied voice on the other end belonging to Lucas. We are accelerating the timeline. Accelerate. The word landed in Adrian's mind like a stone. No, waiting only invites unknown factors. A beat of silence as she listened. The investors have lost their appetite for this kind of protracted uncertainty. Another pause. Yes, I spoke with legal again. Medical incapacity is a surprisingly fluid term, particularly in the absence of any physician-endorsed schedule for recovery. Adrian recorded every syllable, each one a brick being laid in the wall of his new reality. We aren't forcing anything, Vanessa went on, her tone shifting, performing a counterfeit sympathy. We are merely allowing prudence to dictate the necessary course of action. Another silence. Precisely. The moment authority is transferred, the restructuring is no longer an option but a mandate. She spoke of the company he'd bled for as if it were a column of figures. A cold, absolute clarity settled over Adrian's mind. Vanessa ended her call and turned back toward the bed. For a man so pathologically obsessed with control, she said, her voice light, almost conversational, you left a remarkable vulnerability at your own center. She looked down at his face, not with malice, but with the detached interest of a biologist examining a specimen that had failed to adapt. You built an empire on loyalty born of fear, she went on. But fear is a reagent. Adrian, not a foundation. It has no integrity. It dissolves the instant a more profitable allegiance appears. Her hand moved to adjust his blanket, an unconscious gesture of ownership. Your successor needed to be someone more pragmatic. With that, she picked up her handbag and abandoned him to the silence. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer a void. It was a classroom. For a lifetime, Adrian Whitmore had believed control was power. Trapped at the ruins of his own body, he was only now beginning to understand the terrible, elemental truth of what power and its absence truly was. His fortress of control had been a blindfold, obscuring a simple truth, because truth is never a proclamation shouted from a stage. It is a quiet thing, a revelation that lives in the space between the one who tallies your assets in your absence and the one who stays simply because to leave would be a betrayal of her own soul. By the morning of the 8th day, the very atmosphere of the room had changed, a shift Adrian Whitmore could feel in his bones. The mist of ambiguity had frozen, solidifying into a hard, unwelcome certainty. The people who had concluded he would not be coming back were beginning to move as if he were already gone. Their patience had become a finite resource, their caution had begun to fray, and their ambitions no longer hid behind gentle words. Adrian was learning that time does not merely reveal the truth, time gives it a weapon. Beyond the window, a low winter sun threw a weak, watery light against the glass towers of Chicago. The lake, far below the anemic sky, was the color of hammered steel. The city, a vast and indifferent organism, went about its business, utterly oblivious to the quiet verdict being handed down in this one sterile room. At 10 minutes past 8, Nina came in carrying a small paper bag, a newspaper folded neatly under her arm. Her movements were a little slower today, but the quiet stillness of her composure was absolute. She brought with her the scent of toasted bread and hot tea, the simple, elemental warmth of a morning that had started somewhere else. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than usual, as if wrapped around a specific thought. She put the bag on the nightstand, then moved to the window, carefully tilting the blinds so the pale light would not fall across Adrian's eyes. It was a small, familiar kindness, a ritual that imposed a gentle order on the chaos. "I saw my mother on the way in," she said, pouring tea from a thermos into a cup. "She made me promise to bring you this." From the bag, she took a piece of apple bread wrapped in wax paper and set it down. "She says cinnamon is a good weapon against the loneliness of winter." There was no hint of apology in her tone. Nina never seemed to feel that acts of simple grace required an excuse. She simply trusted in them. After checking the drip of his IV and smoothing his blanket, she sat in her usual chair and opened the paper. "I thought I might read to you," she said. "Not the headlines. The news is very rarely good for the soul." A flicker of humor in her tone. "It's a piece about libraries in small towns," she continued, her eyes scanning the column. "About how people conspire to keep them alive, long after the official funding is gone." She paused for a moment. "My mother believes a library's strength comes from our deep need for a quiet room, a place where absolutely no one is asking for anything from you. So," Adrian drank the words in. The idea of a space free from expectation was like a foreign country. His whole life had been built inside the architecture of demand. The demand for leadership, for strength, for absolute, unwavering control. He had rarely been given the simple grace to exist. Nina put the newspaper down. "I think we all need a place where we are not being measured," she said, almost to herself. Her eyes met Adrian's for a moment. "Even the strongest among us." She took a warm, damp cloth and began to gently wipe his hand, her touch slow, her work patient. "You know," she said, her voice dropping, "my brother told me something after he'd been through a terrible year." She paused, as if holding the memory up to the light. "He said, the people who will sit with you in the quiet of your suffering, those are the only ones who know what the word loyalty means." Her fingers stilled on his wrist. "It's never the ones who make the speeches." The words landed with the weight of prophecy, because Adrian's life had been an amphitheater of speeches, vows of loyalty, declarations of allegiance, pronouncements of undying respect, 1,000 performances for an audience of one. but so few had ever just sat with him in the quiet. Nina's voice fell to nearly a whisper. "I do not know what kind of wars you have fought," she said softly, "but I hope if you come back to us, you will remember that not all bonds are forged from armor." Armor! He knew armor. He had spent a lifetime welding his together from calculation and risk. He had believed it was his strength. It occurred to him now that it may have only been his cage, a perfect, polished barrier that had kept anything true from ever getting in. Nina sat in silence, giving room to thoughts she could not know he was having. Then the door opened. Vanessa. Her presence was an immediate shift in pressure, a study in focused energy. Her posture was even sharper than before. She had on a severe wool coat the color of charcoal, and she clutched a leather folio to her chest like a shield. The strain around her eyes was no longer something she tried to conceal. "I need the room," she said. The words were not for Adrian. They were a command to Nina. Nina rose without a word. "Of course!" As she gathered her things, her hand went to his blanket one last time, a final, almost involuntary act of tending. "You are not alone," she whispered. The words meant only for him, lost to the air before they could reach Vanessa, and she was gone. Vanessa stood rigid until the lock clicked shut, then let out a breath that was sharp and final. "This situation is no longer tenable," she breathed, pacing to the window and pulling out her phone. "Yes," she said into it. "Lucas, it's me." Adrian listened, dissecting the sound of each syllable. "The board is losing faith in Richard's ability to manage this," Vanessa said, her voice clipped and efficient. "He is refusing to acknowledge the reality of the situation." A pause. "Yes, the doctors are hedging their language, but the total absence of a neurological response is indicative of significant long-term cognitive damage." Her voice lowered. "We must initiate the transition, not later, now." The word hung in the air, stripped of all euphemism. Adrian did not move. "Yes," Vanessa confirmed. "Our counsel is clear. The prolonged incapacitation clause gives us full authority for a structural reassignment." She listened, and then a dry, hollow laugh escaped her lips. "No, I feel no guilt. Adrian was the one who taught me that emotional attachment is a liability." Another pause. "That's correct." With the transfer of authority, any opposition would become a ghost in the machine. A final pillar within Adrian crumbled, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. The long charade of loyalty was done. A calculated softness entered Vanessa's voice, a predator relaxing its posture. "We will handle the public narrative delicately," she murmured. "Sympathy is an excellent tool for ensuring compliance." Even compassion, it seemed, could be weaponized. "Yes," she continued. "Once board control is secured, redistributing the assets becomes a simple matter of paperwork." Adrian heard the surgical precision in her words. They were dissecting his life into marketable shares. His empire, his name, his very legacy, now just another portfolio to be liquidated. Vanessa's voice dropped to an intimate whisper. "I know," she said. "Soon, none of this will have to be a secret." The words fell into a mind that had no capacity left for shock, only for a terrible and unwelcome understanding. Vanessa ended the transmission, her footsteps a soft report on the sterile floor as she approached his bed. "For a man of your intellect," she said, her voice a flat, placid surface, You never grasped the simple physics of the human heart. She looked down at his still form. You built your world on fear, believing it was the foundation of loyalty. A small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Fear builds a cage of silence. Nothing more. Her coat slid from the chair. You should have been more careful with your trust. And just like that, she was gone. The quiet flooded back into the room. But it was a new kind of quiet, because now Adrian Whitmore held the complete architecture of the betrayal that encased him. Vanessa and Lucas believed they were bearing witness to his undoing. They were, in fact, delivering their own depositions, and every syllable brought Adrian closer to the moment when his silence would no longer be a prison, but a key. For now, he lay beneath the stark white sheets, a statue of a man, cataloging every truth, allowing the testimony to build to its crescendo. By the 9th day, the room had shed its skin of uncertainty. It was now a waiting chamber, the silent space before a judgment is rendered. Outside, the winter sun climbed over Chicago, its anemic light casting long, spectral spears against the glass of opposing towers. The city ticked on with its cold, mechanical rhythm, trains sliding into stations, offices breathing in the morning tide of people, a whole metropolis waking for another day, secure in the bedrock of the structures that held them. But stability, Adrian Whitmore was learning, is so often just a beautifully managed lie. He did not move. The only sound was the patient, rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor, the sole chronicler of time's slow passage. But inside, a lucidity he had not known in years had taken root. The trauma had cooled. The rage had been forged into a single, sharp point. All that remained was the clean, cold shape of what must be done. At 8:05 in the morning, the door opened. Nina. This time she carried a small clutch of white daisies wrapped in simple brown paper. The flowers were a humble offering, a stark counterpoint to the grand, ostentatious arrangements sent to men of his position. Yet they possessed an honesty those blossoms could never claim. They felt true. "Good morning," she offered, her voice a low murmur. It was even, but Adrian could feel the quiet current of worry flowing beneath it. She placed the daisies near the window, a place where they might find the light but escape its burn. "My mother insisted," Nina explained. "She told me to bring something living into this room. She believes recovery needs to be reminded that life continues." With delicate movements, she adjusted the blinds, allowing a warmer, softer light to bleed into the room and dull its clinical glare. "I think she worries that sterile places can make a person feel as if they've already been erased," she added. Nina checked the room's temperature. The IV drip, the lie of his blanket, every motion was performed with the quiet, deliberate grace that defined her. Her small rituals had become the only stable points in his collapsing universe. She settled into the chair beside his bed, folding her hands in her lap for a beat as if centering herself. "I spoke with Dr. Cole this morning," she said, her tone measured. "He says that progress is possible." Possible, a word so small, but in this room it carried the weight of a world. "Hope, my mother says, is a responsibility." Nana's voice was careful, deliberate. "It is a thing we are tasked to carry, especially when it is heavy." Adrian let the words settle in the quiet of his mind. Hope was not a variable in his calculations. He had planned for the cold arithmetic of advantage, the theater of feigned grief, the crushing weight of impatience. But hope Hope had slipped into this sterile room, carried by a woman who had no logical reason to wish for his survival. Nana took the warm cloth to his hand again, her touch meticulous around the IV. "It is a common error," she offered, "to confuse strength with the act of control." She paused. "My mother would say that true strength is the character you fight to keep after all control is taken from you." That sentence struck him with the force of a final judgment. Control was the spine of Adrian's life. Control had built his empire. It had been his armor, and in the end, it had become his tomb. For a brief, electric second, Nana's fingers grazed his wrist, a connection that felt impossibly human. "I cannot know the choices that led you to this place," she went on, her voice soft. "But I do believe a man can change his path, even in the late season of his life." Late in life. A phantom smile flickered in Adrian's thoughts. At 40, he was young enough to build a new world from ash, and just old enough to be haunted by the ghost of the one he'd made. Footsteps in the hall drew Nana's gaze to the door. "I imagine you have not trusted many people," she observed quietly. "In a hard world, trust is an expensive thing." She folded a cloth with precision. "My mother says trust grows slowly, like the weak warmth of a winter sun." The image lingered long after she had spoken it, quiet, relentless, and patient. She sat with him in a silence that was a comfort, not a void, crying out to be filled. And then the door was flung open. "Vanessa." She stood framed in his doorway, the strain more visible than on her other visits. A sheaf of documents was clutched in her hand, her practiced calm stretched thin, worn away by some new and pressing need. "I need a moment alone," she announced, her voice like ice as she acknowledged Nana. Nana stood without a word. "I will check in again later." As she moved past the bed, her hand made one last minor adjustment to his blanket. "You are not alone in here," she whispered, a secret delivered only to him. She left. Vanessa waited until the latch clicked shut before raising her phone. "Yes," she began, the word a clipped, sharp thing. "It's Lucas, again." "It is always Lucas," Adrian thought, sensing a new timbre in her voice today. The urgency pitched higher, the patience worn to a thread. "The board meeting was moved up," Vanessa reported, her voice low and tight. "They're making the argument that extended uncertainty is poison to investor confidence." A beat of silence. "Yes. Richard is still refusing to even entertain a discussion about permanent incapacity." A harder edge cut into her tone now. "He is working under the delusion that Adrian will make a full recovery." Another pause. Vanessa's face seemed to set like stone. "We are losing the time we need to get this confirmed." Adrian remained perfectly still, a silent spectator at his own execution. "The neurologists refused to give any guarantees," she continued. "That lack of certainty is what we can use to our advantage." Advantage. The word had never sounded so cruel. "Yes," Vanessa confirmed, her voice a murmur. "Once the legal declaration of incapacity is made, the control transfer can proceed without any challenge." A pause. "No, the risk is almost nothing." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He never built a single failsafe for his own vulnerability." A profound, cold calm settled over Adrian. He had never allowed for vulnerability in his design, not until now. Vanessa drew closer to the bed, her voice a sharp, quiet blade. The company cannot survive a vacuum of leadership, she whispered, impatience fraying the edges of the words. The markets have no room for sentiment. She listened for a moment to Lucas. Yes, she answered. We will proceed with care. Carefully. The word was a thin layer of civility painted over raw ambition. Adrian knew that cadence now. It was the sound of strategy wearing the mask of concern. Vanessa ended the call and stared down at his unmoving body. Your fatal flaw was the belief that power made you immune to betrayal, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Her face was a perfect neutral mask. But no fortress is invulnerable to the currents of human nature. She adjusted his blanket, a gesture of hollow care. Perhaps this will be the lesson that finally teaches you that all control is an illusion. Temporary. Adrian let the word echo inside him. If control was temporary, then so was this deception, and so was his silence. Vanessa collected her papers and walked out. The door clicked shut. Silence returned, but its quality had changed. It was no longer passive. It was charged with knowledge, because Adrian Whitmore now understood the precise shape of the moment that was coming. The moment his stillness would cease to be a defense and become a weapon. He had heard everything he needed to hear, and he had learned all he needed to learn. He had seen with blinding clarity who remained when there was nothing left to gain. Through the vast hospital window, the winter sun bled out across the Chicago skyline, throwing warped, elongated reflections against the glass towers that had once been his monuments to certainty. Adrian lay beneath the white sheets, the steady beat of the monitor like a metronome, counting down the final seconds. For days he had perfected the illusion of his own absence, unable to listen, to understand, to fight back. But the truth had now delivered its closing argument, and the time for silence was over. The morning came with a brutal, singular clarity. The sky over Chicago was a washed-out, empty canvas, the kind of quiet light that follows a long, cold storm that has scoured the world clean. Light bled through the hospital window, catching the white daisies Na had left yesterday. Their petals held the glow without artifice, content in their simple being. Adrian Whitmore had not slept. His body was stone, but his mind had been a relentless cinema of ghosts and voices, haunted by the realization that the deepest truths of his life were delivered not by confidants, but by a stranger with no motive for her honesty. But now, the stillness had served its purpose. Truth, given enough time, had finally found its form. At 7:40 a.m., the door eased open. Na entered, her canvas tote in hand. A strange thoughtfulness sculpted her expression, as if she could feel the atmospheric pressure in the room shift, though she could not see the cause. "Good morning," she offered, her voice a quiet anchor in the sterile silence. Her tone was calm, but her eyes held his face for a fraction longer than usual. She placed her tote on the visitor's chair, glanced at the thermostat, and gently turned the vase of daisies so they could drink in the morning sun. "My mother says flowers are hardwired to lean toward the warmth," she commented, her voice low. "It's a human instinct, too." She poured hot tea from a thermos into a small paper cup, setting her notebook beside it. "I spoke with Dr. Cole," she said. He noted signs of returning neurological stability. A careful pause. That is the body's way of remembering its own story, how it must go on. Adrian absorbed every syllable. For 9 days, he had been a silent witness to countless monologues. Na's words were different. They weren't rehearsed. She spoke as if language had a physical weight, as if kindness was an act that left ripples in the world. She settled into the chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap. "You know," she began, a certain reflective quality in her voice. "My mother has a belief that life gives us these specific moments, these small windows where we are given permission to start over." Start over. The idea was foreign and impossible language. Adrian Whitmore's life was a testament to forward motion at all costs. Mistakes were buried under new foundations, weaknesses were armored, and losses were swallowed without a sound. But to start over, that was something else. That required humility. Na reached out, her fingers gently adjusting the blanket. "I can't know the weight of what you've carried," she said softly, "but my hope is that when you wake, you choose peace over pride." The words hung in still air between them. Peace over pride. For all his life, Adrian had made the other choice. Pride had been the forge for his power, but it was also the architect of his profound solitude. Na's fingers came to rest on his wrist, a light, grounding pressure against his skin. "I think everyone deserves the chance to finally become the person they were meant to be," she said. The hint of a private smile touched her lips. "My mother calls regret a useless compass unless it's pointing you toward someplace better." In that quiet moment, the last anchor of Adrian's indecision simply dissolved. He had built a dynasty on the bedrock of swift, absolute action. This newfound clarity demanded no less. Before Na could even make a move to stand, the door was thrown open. Vanessa stood there, a sculpture of raw impatience, her body tense, her expression a mask of manufactured urgency. A leather portfolio was clutched in one hand, her phone was already in the other. "I need the room," she commanded, the words clipped. Na rose, her composure a silent rebuke to Vanessa's frantic energy. "Of course." As she gathered her things, she made one last, unconscious gesture, smoothing the blanket across his chest. "You are not alone," she whispered, so low only the air could hear, and she was gone. The door clicked shut, a final metallic sound. Vanessa exhaled sharply, her thumb already swiping across her phone. "Yes," she said into it. The single word, a shard of glass. "Lucas again." It was always Lucas. Adrian listened, his own thoughts now a deep, still lake. "The neurologist's report is useless, still non-committal," Vanessa continued, her voice a conspiratorial murmur. "But the board's patience for a power vacuum is gone." A beat of silence. "Yes. Richard is still the obstacle." Her voice dropped even lower. "We move before he shores up his support." Another pause. "Yes. Once he's legally declared incapacitated, the authority transfers cleanly." Her tone shifted, becoming almost soothing. "It's all about investor confidence." Confidence. Adrian lay perfectly still, a man attending his own execution. Vanessa drifted closer to the bed, a predator drawn to stillness. "He never saw it coming," she whispered into the phone. A pause. No. His belief in his own invincibility was absolute. Another silence stretched. "Yes, Lucas, it's all in place. The final nail. Everything is ready." Adrian opened his eyes. Vanessa froze mid-sentence, the words catching in her throat. The color drained from her face as she stared down at him. the phone slipping from her suddenly damp hand. For one long, suspended beat of time, the only sound in the universe was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor, charting the absolute collapse of her world. Adrian's gaze held no anger, no weakness. It was calm, focused, and utterly, terribly aware. "Good morning, Vanessa," he said, his voice a quiet thing in the loud silence. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The phone call ended. In an instant, the calculator was replaced by the animal, confidence shattered by raw fear. "You," she breathed. With a slow, deliberate motion, Adrian sat up, pulling the thin oxygen tube from his own face. "I heard every word," he stated. It was the complete absence of rage in his voice that finally broke her. Vanessa stumbled back a step, her entire artifice cracking against the unyielding stone of truth. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." His tone was level, without tremor. "You mistook silence for surrender." She searched his face for any hint of the man she thought she knew, for any weakness, and found none. "You planned well," Adrian continued, his voice chillingly calm. "Efficiently." Vanessa fought for the composure that was no longer there. "We were protecting the company," she managed, her voice sharp with desperation, but Adrian's gaze never left hers. "You were protecting your share." An immense silence fell between them. "For 9 days," he said, his voice low, a quiet verdict delivered from the other side of the grave. "I was here." Her carefully constructed reality began to splinter. "You pretended to care for me," he added, a simple statement of fact. Her reply was a fortress of defensive rage. "You were never an easy man to love." The brutal honesty of it was almost a relief. Adrian merely pressed the nurse's call button. Within seconds, Nathan Cole was at the door, Richard Whitmore just a step behind him. Vanessa flinched, the realization landing much too late that she had never been the queen in this game, only a pawn. Nathan calmly folded his arms. "Well," he murmured, "this certainly simplifies the legal questions." Richard Whitmore studied Vanessa with a cold, almost scientific detachment. "You always underestimated the power of patience," he observed. Vanessa said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Within the hour, the great, impersonal machine of consequence began to turn. Vanessa Caldwell was legally and financially severed from all Whitmore holdings. Lucas Whitmore's access was revoked, his corporate existence put on ice, pending a full inquiry. The silence returned to the room, but it was a different kind now. It was clean. Later that afternoon, Nina came back, entirely unaware of the day's violent turning points. She stopped just inside the door, seeing Adrian sitting up in the chair by the window, washed in the pale afternoon light. For a moment, she just stood there, her mind a battlefield between confusion and a slow-dawning wonder. "You're awake," she breathed, the words barely a whisper. Adrian turned his head toward her. "Yes." A complex tide of emotion washed over her face. Relief, followed by a profound and sudden shyness. "I'm glad," she said softly, setting her small canvas bag on a distant chair, suddenly hesitant to approach. "You stayed," Adrian observed, his voice flat. She hesitated. "It was my job." He corrected her, his tone gentle but firm. "No, it wasn't." Another silence settled, this one filled with a new and unspoken meaning. "You spoke the truth to a man you thought would never hear you," Adrian continued. Nina looked down at her hands. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, she whispered. He rose and moved toward her. For the first time in a very long life, he said, his voice quiet, someone stayed when there was absolutely nothing left to gain. Her face was an open book of confusion, unable to navigate where this was going. I have misjudged nearly everything, he admitted, his voice steady. But I did not misjudge you. He brought out a small velvet box from the pocket of his robe. Nana's eyes widened. This is, she began, her voice trailing off into nothing. Unexpected, she finally managed. So were you, Adrienne replied. He opened the box. Inside was a single diamond on a simple band. Not a spectacle, not a transaction, something true. His gaze held hers, unwavering. I have spent a lifetime surrounded by people who were impressed by what I could do, he said, a lifetime of truth in the words. You were the only one who seemed to care about who I was. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and sudden. I can't promise you a simple life, he went on, but I can promise you an honest one. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical presence in the room. I want to build something that lasts, Adrienne says, his voice cutting through the stillness. Nana's words are barely a whisper. You don't even know me. His response is instant, unwavering. I know you didn't run when it would have been the easiest thing in the world. Air catches in her throat, a sudden, sharp intake. That's all I need to know. A long moment passes, thick with unspoken history. Then a slow, deliberate incline of her head. It was a surrender. Not the power, not for the money, but for the raw honesty that had finally cracked through a lifetime of calculation. Outside the window, a pale winter sun bled its light across the city Adrian Whitmore once owned through fear. Now he was thinking about laying the first stone of something else entirely. This story stands as a testament to a difficult truth. While force can demand compliance, only compassion can ever earn allegiance. A person's mettle is not revealed when life is simple, but in the crushing crucible of loss. The ones who stay with us at our most fragile are the only ones who ever truly see us. Fortune and station may buy applause from the cheap seats, but they hold no power to forge a single genuine bond. In the end, sincerity, dignity, and a quiet grace possess a resilience that fear can never hope to shatter. Justice is not always a public spectacle. Sometimes it is simply the quiet dawn when truth is finally acknowledged and the soul chooses what is right over what is easy. This tale is a work of fiction brought to life with the assistance of artificial intelligence. Each character, every circumstance, and all the events you see are phantoms, born of imagination and not meant to cast the shadow of any real person or history. This work was created solely for the art of storytelling and the exploration of the human heart.